Namaste. I'm Nayaswami Asha, and we're continuing our discussion of the essence of the Bhagavad Gita, explained by Paramhansa Yogananda, as remembered by his disciple Swami Kriyananda. We are up to chapter 3 of this book of commentary, which is not the same chapters as the Gita. In fact, until we get into chapter 2, about verse 10, I think it is, Swamiji just talks in a general way. So we'll continue in the same light. I began last week a little bit to talk about this chapter in this book, about the fact that the Gita is an allegory, and what it's representing is not only this historical battle, the field of Kurukshetra, which is a real place, and a few of the real characters, the Pandavas, the Kauravas, but the reason that this scripture has endured for so long is because what it's really talking about is the inner experience of every devotee. And Arjuna in the story represents all of us. And parts of this we'll deal with again later as we go along, but just to get a whole picture of what's happening now. The Gita, as I explained, is one chapter out of a much longer epic, and that epic is the Mahabharata. I myself have told the story of the Mahabharata on a number of occasions. If you go to the YouTube channel that has my name on it, Nayaswami Asha, if you go into YouTube and look for Nayaswami Asha, you'll find the retelling of the Mahabharata with the whole story, with all of the symbolism that Master attributed to it, and having that story explained. Many of my Indian friends, and I'll quote exactly, "She's a white woman, and listen to her talk about the Mahabharata." I never thought of myself as a white woman until I went to India, because I'm just what I am. But the Mahabharata is everybody's story. I may mispronounce the words, but the spirit of it really lives in our hearts, and it's wonderful. The whole epic, as I was explaining last week, Master talked about how it's held Indian culture together through Kali Yuga. He talked about how his own mother would discipline him through the stories of the Mahabharata. Well, the Gita is the essential message of the whole Mahabharata, told with this tremendous power. And the battle of Kurukshetra is the battle of our own consciousness. We'll go into a little bit more detail as we go along, but just excuse me for just a minute. I have an itchy nose, which is completely distracting me. Oh. Okay, there we go. One of the things that Swamiji writes that helps us to understand that this has to be allegorical and can't be real is that this takes place on the eve of a battle. And the whole story of how we came to that battle is what the Mahabharata is about. The intensity of the battle, the degree of antagonism, the efforts that have been made to avoid the battle, and finally all forces have conspired, and it's got to be now a fight to the death. And as we talk more about the allegory and as we go through the whole Bhagavad Gita, that in itself is a very significant part of what makes the story so powerful, which is that the inner struggle that every devotee faces, which is to try to see if there is an alternative to the absolute commitment that the spiritual path requires of us. In this great scripture, Krishna says, out of 1,000, only one seeks God. And out of 1,000 who seek God, only one finds God. Although Paramhansa Yogananda commented on that verse, and he said, speaking of our path, our percentage is higher, which I found very encouraging. He didn't say how much higher, but nonetheless higher. But what is trying to be said by that is that when you finally understand, it takes a long time, and only a few people understand what's really required. In very casual terms, in America where I live, and there's many different spiritual ashrams, I've heard people comment about the path of self-realization as we follow it, It says, many people talk about giving up the ego, and then my friend put it this way, but you people really mean it, and that this is a real battle, that we're not just here to have a comfortable life and sort of add into it a few, sort of graceful gestures towards spiritual life. This is really the forces of delusion and the forces of enlightenment pitted against each other, and that's what the Battle of Kurukshetra was. And on the eve of battle, and as I was starting to say, after this enormous process, historically as it's described, of diplomacy and failed diplomacy and threats and counter threats, everybody's on the battlefield and the only thing left to do is fight. And Krishna is driving Arjuna's chariot. And still, in this last moment, Arjuna says to Krishna, wait a minute, give me a minute, I want to think about this again. And he asks Krishna to drive him to the space between the two armies. And he wants to survey both his own army and the enemy army. Well, as Swamiji points out in the commentary, if this were a real war, the general would not be so foolish as to expose himself to the enemy at that moment. But since the battle is inside, and the real force is introspection and self-understanding, we often, God, represented by Krishna, we are often intuitively guided, and we stand and we do look at both sides. We look at what we aspire to become. We look at other members of our family, because this is a war between cousins. We look at those qualities that we were raised with, the story of the cousins. They were raised together. They were tutored by the same people, but they have very different objectives in the end. And so Arjuna looks at his cousins and he looks at the forces that they have arrayed, and they're familiar to him. He has affection for them. He remembers fondly the good times they had together. And this is exactly the way in our own selves when we're moving on the eve of battle and we really have to make a spiritual commitment, whether that commitment has some dramatic external form, leaving home to find God, to join the ashram, to repudiate something that has been part of your life for a long time. You hesitate and you look and you remember, we used to party a lot together and he used to be my friend and my carousing, or I used to really enjoy that kind of music or that way of spending my time, and now I have to battle against it. I can no longer take that with me because it's not going to serve the cause of righteousness to which I am now committed. And Arjuna stands between the two forces and he laments to Krishna as the story progresses. He laments to Krishna, I don't want to do this battle. And the whole of the Bhagavad Gita is Krishna urging Arjuna to go forward on the path of righteousness and to fight the battle even unto the death if required, because righteousness simply demands it. And it's notable that every significant spiritual epic of every single spiritual tradition is always war. And I know in American feminism, when women started getting the upper hand and trying to express themselves in lots of ways which I don't object to, but sometimes they would attack things that should not have been attacked, like saying that these epics are always war because it's a patriarchal picture of reality. That's a very immature view. They're always war because it is war. And one of the reasons that the Bhagavad Gita is so important is that it truthfully and poignantly and with profound and deep accuracy explains the battle of Kurukshetra that we all have to fight. That we are on both sides of the question. It's not like delusion is so self-evidently unattractive. it's very enmeshed in our very way of being from many incarnations of making choices. And Master speaks of it so sweetly in a way that is really so subtle. He said if in our incarnations it was nothing but misery, absolute misery, unrelieved misery, then we would easily repudiate our attraction to the world. By the world, what I mean is to seeking our fulfillment in an outward way. I'm not just talking about the lives that we have to lead. It's not so simple as the form of your life. It's much more where you seek your satisfaction. Because after all, in the story of Arjuna, he's a king and he's fighting for a kingdom. And he has wealth and he has possessions and he has wives and children. And so he's not trying to be a Himalayan yogi. He's not just repudiating all of that. But he's having to live righteously in the midst of all of that. So what the world is the expectation that something outside of my own inner reality will actually give me a happiness that I don't already have inside. And so the subtlety of Maya, as I was starting to say, is that this world is very reminiscent at times of the deeper fulfillment we are seeking. We find that in human love. We find that in friendship, in good works that we can do. We find many satisfactions that are a reflection of our own inner reality. But in the end, the degree to which we are depending on those outer fulfillments to give us inner satisfaction, to that extent we are disappointed time and time again. It just happens every time. I was speaking to a friend yesterday whose sons are now grown men, and she was a devoted mother and still deeply loves her sons, but their lives have gone according to their own trajectory, and the family that she was so attached to and was able to enjoy when they were small, it's simply transformed into something completely else that is not in itself unfulfilling, but it no longer gives her that sweet satisfaction she had when they were small and they were in her world and they were calling her mommy and they were telling her how much they loved her and how they would always be there, always to take care of her. And now they're living their own lives, even respectfully and kindly, but it's over. And that's what happens in all of our lives. And Master said this is the reason why we reincarnate again and again, because it almost works. And we remember the part that did work, and we try to come back again and see if we can't hold on to that eternally. But sooner or later, in the Battle of Kurukshetra, the choice is really in front of us. Do I shift my loyalty, my commitment, my willingness to give everything I have for eternal fulfillment, or do I continue to just hope against hope, just hope that somehow this time it'll be different. This time death and change won't take over. Of course, at a certain time, the devotee just knows. The words that Master uses in Autobiography of a Yogi are so touching. He says, after a while, this cycle of reincarnation assumes a certain anguishing monotony. And it's a very exquisitely chosen phrase, because we see where this is going. We see that even beautiful and deeply fulfilling as this experience is, we know where it's going. It's going to end in dissolution. It's going to end in death. And then we begin to do battle. And in the Mahabharata, with the Kauravas and the Pandavas, the Pandavas representing the devotee and the spirit, Arjuna particularly, he tries every way to see if we can't make them both work together Can't I just have both? Can't I be a devotee and have all the satisfactions of the fulfillment in this world too? And step by step, by the allegory of the war itself in the Mahabharata, it's proven again and again that there's no compromise, that it has to be a whole-on confrontation, and the spiritual power has to give itself completely to defeat the forces of, yes, I can be happy in the material world. Yes, it will fulfill me in the way that I want. Now, one of the things about this scripture that, and let me just say one more thing actually about the war. It's really the line in the sand for devotees. Now, don't misunderstand me, and this is what I was about to say in a moment. It's not as if we make this decision and then after that we hate the world and we repudiate it and everything in the world is evil and dark. That's not the way Swamiji and Master have taught us. Swamiji talks about having met in India a certain sadhu, and that sadhu had taken a very austere attitude toward renunciation. And the sadhu declared to Swamiji, "You must never enjoy anything in this world." And Swamiji said, "Well, not even a beautiful sunrise?" And the sadhu said, "No, not even the sunrise. Everything in this world must be considered to be the enemy." And Swamiji said, that's not how Master taught us. Master taught us that there are things in this world that are reflective of divine beauty. But what we must understand is they are only reflections of divine beauty, and that we feel that divine joy within ourselves, that our lives begin internally in attunement with that ever-present inner reality, and then with that joy we can enjoy everything in this world, because everything in this world then is a manifestation of the divine. And the bhav, so to speak, of Yogananda himself, and certainly of Swami Kriyananda, whom I was privileged to see in life, was one of a constant bubbling enthusiasm. And it wasn't a bubbling enthusiasm out of attachment for the things that he was seeing and doing. It was an inherent bubbling enthusiasm that was based on his own connection with his own inner joy, and bringing that joy to every circumstance. Every circumstance had the potential to be joyful. Even when the circumstance itself was painful, disappointments, persecutions, tragedies in other people's lives, tragedies in one's own life, still, underneath it, there was always this sense of one's true self. And in the Bhagavad Gita, as we progress, Krishna and Arjuna discuss that, and Krishna explains to Arjuna that what you perceive as death, because now they were talking about the war itself, where Arjuna actually had to kill someone. Krishna would say, "You see the body falling." He said, "I see the spirit rising." And so, even in the midst of the ephemeral waves of external life changing, there's always a deeper level of reality going on. And in the end, what makes the Bhagavad Gita, the scripture that has endured for all this time and is applicable to all religious traditions, to all spiritual paths, to all stages of life, is the exquisite way it explains not only the inner world but also the outer world. And Master comments about the Bhagavad Gita, and Swamiji explains that the Gita can be interpreted in a way that applies to every level of life. And this is an important part also in general about the spiritual path, and is also one of the themes of the allegory here. I remember Swami Kriyananda remarked once about a person who other people perceived, he was a spiritual leader, he was a popular spiritual leader. There was a time in America in the 60s and 70s, even into the 80s, when these teachings, which is the idea of an inner reality and aspects of Indian teaching, were invading American shores. And Ananda grew up in the midst of that social phenomenon, although our tradition and our longevity has been different than most. But this particular teacher was making a moderate splash in the American scene. And Swami made an interesting comment. He said, he's put his spirituality on from the outside. He's understood how a spiritual teacher should behave, and he's disciplining himself to behave that way. He said, but true spirituality grows from the inside out. And it's exactly like the sprouting of a seed, which is an image that has been very helpful to me in understanding how spiritual life really works. And the Bhagavad Gita is very helpful to us in this way. If you have a small seed that's going to sprout, or let's say a flower bulb, last year friends gave us a hyacinth bulb in a glass jar, and the bulb itself, when you see it, it's just a brown stone is what it looks like, and you plant it in this glass container, and the fun of the glass container is that you can watch the development of that hyacinth until from just looking like a rock until it becomes this beautiful flower, and you can watch the roots go down and the plant go up. Normally it would be in the ground and you wouldn't see the whole picture. This particular bulb, I had to leave town before it finished, but I've watched them before. But what's so amazing about it, you see, is that it will flower. It will reach its beautiful potential, but it has to go stage by stage. And there's many stages when it does not look like a flower, but it absolutely cannot get to being a flower unless it goes through all of those stages. We have apple trees, an apple tree in our yard here, and we eat the apples, and there's seeds in the center of the apple. And each one of those seeds has the potential to be as sturdy and as impressive and as productive as the tree in the backyard here. But to get from something that's smaller than my fingernail to something that I can climb into and sit comfortably inside and eat the apples off the branches, it simply has to grow through every progressive stage. And one of the reasons why it's important for Scripture to describe, to relate to all levels of life, is for we ourselves to understand how to negotiate all those stages and to be comfortable in our own hearts. I remember a friend was communicating with me through letter, and he was always, the initial question he raised is, no matter how hard I try to change myself, I always fail. I never can make any changes. It took me a little time to figure out what his question really was and what the answer really was, because that dedication, why was that dedication not being fulfilled? But I realized that in that enthusiasm of dedication, he was actually trying to embrace stages of development that were really not genuinely his own. And so he was trying to renounce things that were not appropriate for him to renounce. I remember Swami Kriyananda once was giving a satsang for a group of people who live good spiritual lives, but are also embroiled in jobs and family and materialistic concerns and just, I don't know exactly how to say it. That was the stage at which their seed was sprouting. And I would be presumptuous to say that they were less dedicated. It was just the stage they were sprouting. And Swami gave a very moving talk about the level of renunciation on which he lives. in which to own anything was literally painful for him. But after he gave that talk, he said to that group, he said, don't even try to live the way I'm living. He said, you wouldn't be able to do it, and it wouldn't even be appropriate for you to try. And I've really meditated on that a lot, because sometimes we get this zealous belief that, I'm going to kill this in me, I'm going to fight the battle of Kurukshetra, and I'm going to fight against this, and I'm going to fight against that. But what happens in the whole Mahabharata, and to an extent in the Bhagavad Gita part of it, appropriate enemies are pitted one against the other. And there's a whole protocol, and this is more in the Mahabharata than in the Gita, about who fights who. And with all the characters being symbolic, it's like not everybody fights Arjuna. Not everybody fights the biggest heroes. Smaller heroes fight smaller enemies. And when you fight the appropriate battle in the appropriate way, then you can have victory. Master said it's very important on the spiritual path to choose the right battles. Because if you constantly throw yourself against a foe, and in this case I mean an attachment or a delusion, that you're simply not, you're not at the right stage where you can, you have to develop more before you can do that battle, then you'll just be defeated. And you'll end up like my friend who writes to me and says, no matter how hard I try, I can't change. And after a long time, I finally realized, I said, it's not a lack of willpower or even dedication. I said, what you're suffering from is a lack of patience. You're trying to get to the end of the path without walking the path, without simply and deeply acknowledging within yourself, this is the appropriate stage of development for me. This is who I really am. We stand in the battle of Kurukshetra, we stand between the two armies, and we survey who is on our side, who are the heroes on our side, who are the delusions on the other side, and then we have to pick our battles according to the strength that we have. Now, it's a very subtle thought, and I'm not able to finish it completely here. We'll talk about it some through the discussion of the Gita, and it's discussed in more detail in many other things many other classes and so on that I've offered. But consider it. You see, it takes great self-honesty to be able to say, this is who I really am, and this is what's right for me. Now, related to that is another very interesting fact about this. Let me find it, what I'm trying to say here. The Bhagavad Gita deals. That's what I was wanting to say. There's another interesting feature why the Bhagavad Gita is so universal, because the Gita itself is about Krishna and Arjuna, and the whole context is related to what people think of as Hinduism. Although in an earlier session here, I was explaining about what Sanatana Dharma is and how Sanatana Dharma is the underlying truth, and religions are all just an expression of it. Well, the Gita takes this a step further, because the Gita talks about the different temperaments and how what really divides the world is not so much whether you're a Christian or a Buddhist or a Hindu. It divides us spiritually, but what kind of temperament we have in our pursuit of our spiritual ambition. And some people are bhaktis, as you call it, where you are guided primarily by the heart. It's love that moves us, and it's an automatic sense of devotion. And we express our spiritual life through devotion, and that doesn't just mean chanting and rituals and so on, but it's a feeling of understanding things first by the love of the heart. That comes naturally. A dear friend of mine with a very sweet nature just said to me in her inimitable, innocent way, she said, I find it very easy to love everyone. She says, that just comes very naturally to me. And of course it does. She's a bhakti by nature. Everywhere she looks, she sees God's presence and she automatically loves that presence. There are others who make progress more through the path of wisdom by discrimination. And all of these paths all eventually merge together, as we'll talk about it. But they like to think about things. And I don't mean that the heart isn't required, but they understand spiritual truth and they see the reality of what must be true. I was listening to Swami Kriyananda talk about key transitions in his own search for God. And he, toward the end of his life, would often tell the story of how he was trying to understand the meaning of life. And he wasn't so much looking for God as he was looking for the truth about life and the experience he was having. And he talked about going for a long walk by the ocean and seeing how the ocean would come in and how it would circulate among the crevices of the rocky shore right there. And he began to understand that the force of that great ocean was the power of consciousness, and that consciousness was animating everything in the universe, including himself. And he could see that the ocean was allowed to enter to the extent that the rocky crevices were wide enough. The wider the crevice, the more the ocean could flow through it. The narrower the crevice, the less of that ocean could come through. And it just came to Swamiji in a powerful revelation that he was a conscious being, and the consciousness he was expressing had to be greater than just something he was inventing on his own, and that he could see suddenly that success in life, that the meaning and truth of life was the degree to which he opened the channel of his own nature and allowed more and more of that ocean to flow through. And he translated that revelation that began by watching ocean water flowing into rocks. He translated that into the purpose of life is to seek God, to become a perfect channel for that divine consciousness. Now, he says later, it would have been easier for him to have gone by the path of love, for him to have just felt the beauty and the glory of God's presence, and in his love for that, come to the same conclusion, but that wasn't his way. At that time, it wasn't his way. He came to it by watching and thinking and reasoning, and the actual word is discriminating between that which is lastingly real, that which is merely superficial in its impression. And in every spiritual tradition, there are those who learn by learning, and who don't merely intellectualize, that's something quite different, but who benefit from understanding the subtleties of these truths. And Swamiji, of course, in the end, was a perfect balance of all these qualities. He developed, once he met his guru, he consciously and under his guru's tutelage and under the influence of his guru opened that power of love in his heart. But what it did is, the more he was able to love, the more capable he also became of discerning truth through the power of discrimination. And so those are two different ways of working toward divine realization. And the third way, another way of working, is those who are active, who are neither who don't necessarily spend hours in study and discrimination, or even hours in bhakti practices, but who serve, who find their joy in actively doing good works and serving others. And again, there's many ways and levels to do good works, and the Gita makes this all very clear. We can do good works out of a sense of social conscience, or we can do good works out of a deep desire to serve God. But that may be the way in which we find our path. And then, of course, there are those who are contemplatives, who may follow all the paths eventually come together, but there's also the path that is commonly called Raja Yoga, which includes it all, but also adds to it the path of direct communion. Now, what the Gita makes clear is that these temperaments are actually the religions of the world, in a sense. That whether they worship Jesus or follow Krishna or are devoted to the Buddha, what really divides us is whether we follow first the heart, whether we discriminate and study, whether we're active in service, whether we contemplate and commune directly. And devotees of a heart nature will have more in common with other devotees of a heart nature on other spiritual paths than they may have with a scholar in their own tradition. And this is yet one more way in which the Bhagavad Gita unites. And even though, as I say, it comes from one tradition, it unites. It unites all traditions, because every devotee, everyone who is seeking God, whatever their formal outer affiliation, will find in the Gita specific instructions not only for taking them through all stages of life, all stages from the seed blossoming into its full potential as an apple tree, but also for guiding each soul according to its own temperament, and for eventually rounding us all out so that we embrace elements of all those temperaments in the full and noble path. And it behooves us, and this is one of the reasons why Master taught not only from the Gita but also from the Bible, because he was wanting to show how universal self-realization is. Self-realization being a specific way of describing Sanatana Dharma. We all follow the same path. Everyone in the world follows the same path. We just follow it each in our own way, culturally, religiously, but most deeply according to our own inclinations. Swamiji, Master writes in the Autobiography of a Yogi about how Babaji and Jesus have been concerned about the development of the world. They've been concerned about the materialism, and they've been concerned about the rising technology that gives us an increasing capacity to destroy both civilization and the planet, and the fact that our moral and spiritual understanding is a little behind, and that technological capability for violence is a little bit ahead of the moral and spiritual clarity required to keep us from doing it. And the advent of self-realization, the advent of Paramhansa Yogananda, what has been in response to the concern of the masters for the well-being of the planet, and the hope for peace and generosity and understanding is when we recognize our global unity, and where that global unity is more than just a pleasing sentiment. A pleasing sentiment is pleasing. It's a very nice feeling to sense our unity, and many things are happening on the planet that are very feels good. They do really make us feel very happy. But for real change to take place, there has to be a genuine transcendence of self-interest and a recognition that my true self-interest comes from the welfare of all. And that's a level that's a stage that you can't fake. If one is too deeply identified with the limited self, which is to say the egoic self, then you simply can't fight the battle and win. I mean, that is the battle that you have to fight. And when it comes right down to it, one will choose one's own egoic self. And That's what we see going on in the world around us right now. There's no lack of capacity to solve all that ails us. I mean, everyone in this world could be well-fed and comfortable, but there has to be a will to do that. And in order for that will to be there, well, the battle of Kurukshetra has to be fought. And the battle of Kurukshetra, I mean, it may turn into an actual external battle between the forces of selfishness and greed and the forces of righteousness, real universal welfare. But it also has to be fought on the level of each one of us. We influence the direction of the planet far more than we realize individually. Our thoughts are a power. And the battle of Kurukshetra that all of us have to fight is to suppress, destroy, and in fact eliminate those qualities which pull us back towards selfishness and greed and a misunderstanding of where our fulfillment comes, and a victory for true understanding. It starts as self-discipline, which is the first step, but then it actually blossoms into a spontaneous expression. Like my friend said, I just love everybody. It's very easy for me to do. She's a very advanced soul, and that's just how she sees the world. She just loves everybody. And when you love everybody, your life becomes extremely different. In this particular epic, Swamiji explains to us that when Vyasa was writing this, in order to make the allegory complete, he created a lot of, the major characters in this allegory are all historical, and that's one of the reasons why our devotion to Krishna is so powerful, is because Krishna is a real figure. His life has become somewhat shrouded in myths and legends, but the reality of who Krishna is as an avatar and as a pure manifestation of the divine is truth. And Krishna's relationship to Arjuna is truth. Yogananda himself, as I said earlier, said that he himself was Arjuna, and that the soul that is now living as Babaji manifested as Krishna. And just from the point of view of devotees of Yogananda's path, this story of the Gita is really our story. It's the masters that we follow today, laying the groundwork for the experience that we're having now. This saga of soul evolution is quite a rich and an ancient one. You know, the process of each one of these little seeds becoming an apple tree is truly astonishing. In the incarnation of Arjuna, Paramhansa Yogananda was free already. But it's profoundly important to remember the fact that even these great souls, whether Yogananda or Arjuna, whoever they are, they attained their self-realization. It was not merely given to them without going through all the stages. I often think about this because I find it to be a powerful comfort in my relationship with Guru, is to realize not only that Yogananda's sympathies or Swami Kriyananda's sympathies extend to the reality that I'm going through, but whatever vibration of consciousness I am presently experiencing. And you see, every delusion, even though it may become very specific for us, I'm attached to this house, I'm attached to this child, I'm attached to this level of comfort or recognition in the world, I'm frightened by that kind of pain or that kind of persecution. If you could actually give a vibratory number to that thought form as the perfection of spiritual freedom and the lowest to which an individual jiva can fall, if you could calibrate it like the notes on the piano and say that this delusion has this number of vibrations, or this wave pattern, however you wanted to look at it, I suspect you could do that, but I don't know how. the jiva that manifests as Arjuna, the jiva that manifests as Lord Krishna, as a fully self-realized being, an avatar with no karma of his own, reincarnating merely to enlighten us, they pass through, that jiva pass through every vibration that we're passing through. That's why Krishna can speak with so much power on every level. That's why what he says applies to every level, because he actually, at one point, that jiva was limited to whatever vibration we're presently experiencing. This is vitally important for our spiritual welfare, because we have to be completely unafraid to open our reality to the Guru so that the Guru can help us. Even this allegory of Arjuna, when you think about it, is very interesting, because what happens, and this will unfold as we go into the Gita, is that it's time to pick up his weapon, pick up his bow, in the case of Arjuna, and the bow represents meditation. The straight side of the bow and the curved, the curved bow and the straight string is the straight spine and the curved chest, and the arrow that you put into the bow is the arrow of your concentration. It's a symbol of meditation, in fact. And it's time for Arjuna to straighten his spine, to string his bow, and to launch those arrows of discrimination into the heart of delusion and to dissolve that delusion. That's the allegory of the war. And Arjuna fights with the bow. He's the devotee and the meditating devotee. But it's time to engage. And Arjuna says to Krishna, wait a minute, I want to stop and think about this again. And his guru goes with him. He's his charioteer. He takes him out there, and they look again, and then they have this long conversation. And the conversation is Arjuna asking Krishna, do I really have to do this? And on a certain level, you just really love that fact, that even on the eve of battle, Arjuna hesitated for a moment. And it gives us all permission. Of course, in the end, Arjuna listens very carefully to the advice that Krishna gives him. And he accepts that, and he draws up his courage, and he goes into battle. And in the whole story of the Mahabharata, which is not contained in the Gita, he triumphs. And spirituality triumphs over materialism, as ultimately it must. But in the meantime, Krishna is able to be right where Arjuna is, and Arjuna is able to be right where each one of us are. And Vyasa draws this whole story together with all these different characters, with all these different inclinations, with all these different orientations, all these different vibratory delusions. And they, one by one, we fight each of these battles, and one by one, in the whole story of the Mahabharata, they confront each other, they struggle, and then one triumphs. Good triumphs. Sometimes the delusion wins a temporary battle, but in the end, all the heroes of the Pandavas' side will win. And this is the confidence also, you see, that the Bhagavad Gita gives us. It's an allegory in which it's shown to us that spirit will triumph, that our own inner devotion and longing for God will triumph. Now, Swamiji, going on into chapter 4, he also gives us some examples which many people might not be aware of how these allegories live in all great scripture, and that sometimes trying to interpret the scripture too literally is really not going to serve us. We need to understand that, you see, these things are not so easy to say in simple rational concepts. The worlds we're describing are beyond the worlds that are accessible to the rational mind. Don't misunderstand. That doesn't mean in any way that these cannot be understood. They can be understood, but they can't be completely brought down to the mundane level. There also has to be a certain intuition, has to be raised by the power that's in them. Yogananda wrote a book of prayers called Whispers from Eternity, which many of you, of course, know. And he described how those prayers were revelations that he had. They were revelations of the experience. It wasn't the idea of the experience or the description of the experience. It was the experience. And I spoke earlier about revelation. He saw those realities and he entered into them and he knew them to be true. And then he had to put them down into words. But he called the words a doorway into the experience. And so when Vyasa wrote the Mahabharata and the Gita within it, these are doorways into the actual experience, and that's why you can read the Gita over and over again for your whole life. And each time you read it, it gives you something else. Because as we develop and our vibration becomes more refined, we're able to merge and perceive and merge into a higher vibration that is inherent in what's being described, in the symbol of what's being described, and in, actually, as Master said, behind the paper and ink, as it were, there is actually a living consciousness. And so Swamiji, in order to universalize the concept of what the Gita is doing, he talks a little bit about other allegories, one with which I myself am familiar because I was raised in a Jewish family, is the exodus of the Jews from slavery in Egypt. And a great master was sent to the Jewish people, Moses. In traditional Judaism, they never talk about it like this, but when I came to self-realization and began to understand what Sanatan Dharma, and began to appreciate that all true religions, including the one I was raised in, Judaism, all stem from the same perception of reality, I was able to go back into the stories of my childhood and the images that I had grown up with and see them from an entirely new light. Moses, for example, who's a very ancient figure, and therefore there's not a lot that we have. We just have little bits and pieces, but Moses was able to raise the serpent in the wilderness. And when, that's how it's written in the scripture, and when Swamiji asked Master if Moses was also a self-realized master, Yogananda replied, yes, because he was able to raise the serpent in the wilderness. And wilderness is a symbol in many different scriptures, and it also appears in the New Testament a lot. Jesus will go into the wilderness, and the wilderness is the inner world, the world where the things of the world do not exist. If you go off into the wilderness, you've stepped beyond the borders of the material world as we know it. And to raise the serpent in the wilderness, Yogananda said, is a perfectly clear statement of to raise the Kundalini. Kundalini is the serpent power coiled at the base of the spine, and all through the traditions of Sanatan Dharma as expressed in India, you're always seeing the snake. And in the New Testament, the snake is referred to, and you have power over the snake, you have power over the poisonous serpent. And the poison is when the Kundalini is drawn downward and commits you to the things of the material world. To be able to resist that poison is to awaken the Kundalini energy and to pull it back from its material commitment and rise it up the spine until you have the power over delusion because you're focused at the spiritual eye. Moses raised the serpent in the wilderness, and he was able then, because of that power, he was able to take the Jewish people out of slavery. And the whole story, the book of Exodus in the Old Testament, is an allegory just like the Bhagavad Gita, and also historical. The Jewish people were in fact enslaved to the Egyptian Pharaoh. And whenever virtue declines and vice begins to predominate, as it says in the Bhagavad Gita, and we'll come to this verse, the Infinite Lord takes human form and he restores virtue. The Jewish people were a devout people who, through many ages and cycles of declining yugas on this planet, managed to hold on to, I will call it the true teaching, not true because it was Judaism, but true because it was Sanatana Dharma. And the Jewish people were very powerful in history. They drew the avatar Moses. Moses was an avatar coming to that group because of their deeply sincere desire to know the truth. In the Festival of Light, we say, a prayer of love went up from earth and you responded. A ray of your light burst out from the heart of infinity through dark clouds of delusion and took human form for the salvation of mankind. That's exactly what the Gita says. When virtue declines and vice predominates, I incarnate. And the Jewish people had this powerful determination for the truth. And Moses was drawn by that call of aspiring love. And they were physically enslaved to the Egyptians, and they were spiritually enslaved to a wrong understanding. The aspiration was there, but the teaching had corrupted. So Moses pulled them out. And the story of Exodus is their incredible, dramatic escape. But then, strangely, they wander for 40 years in the Sinai desert before they find the Promised Land. And the external story is the Promised Land is Palestine, which is the modern-day state of Israel. And a huge political and external reality has been created based on Moses taking the Jewish people to Palestine, and that being the Promised Land. And there is historical accuracy to it. But the true Promised Land is internal. It's the relationship with God and Guru and the internal realization of the divine. And Swamiji writes here, just to give us an idea of allegory, that the Promised Land is described as the land of milk and honey. And in yoga practice, there's an esoteric practice where the tongue is turned backwards in something called Kachari Mudra. And it happens spontaneously, or it's something you can develop. And when it's done properly, there's a certain nectar that the devotee actually tastes that is said to taste like a combination of milk and honey. And that you can live on that nectar, and that's the way that great yogis can often live without food or go into deep ecstatic states. And they live in the Promised Land on milk and honey, effortlessly on milk and honey. And that's part of the allegory. In the Vedas, they talk about soma, is the word that's used, nectar. And modern day people think that they had some kind of a drug, like LSD or a psychedelic mushroom or something like that. It's not at all. These are allegories. These are symbols for those who know of what is really taking place. And in all scriptures, these are true. The Christian scripture is filled with the same thing. Jesus often went into the wilderness. And in fact, Moses was in the wilderness for 40 years, and Jesus was in the wilderness for 40 days. Even the numbers are the same. And after that dedicated time in the wilderness, then they're taken into the Promised Land, and their people are freed from slavery. And great, powerful things happen. So even though we're studying the Bhagavad Gita, and it's this one unique story of the battle of light and darkness, we can see that throughout all the ages, throughout all the scriptures, the same story has been told again and again and again. And the thrilling eternal drama of the soul's long journey back to its home in God. In this way, the great masters tell it and retell it and inspire and re-inspire until every stray brother and sister is freed. Well, God bless you, and we'll continue in our next session.